Welcome if you've joined us since the start. If you don't know who I am, I'm Alex Lyell. I am a pastor here at Streatham Central Church, and we are continuing the series that we started last week in Genesis and the life of Jacob and Joseph. Now let's just do a very quick zoom out. So God's plan from day one, when he created human beings, and from the first page of the Bible, is that we would be happy in relationship with him. The first thing he did for humanity was he blessed them. And that doesn't mean sort of he generally acted like a strange priest and put his hand on their heads and said, "Bless you, my child." No, he made them to be fulfilled in the world that he had made. A deep fulfillment in which they work and they have authority and they walk alongside him. It's a beautiful picture of the dependence on God that we were made for in order to thrive in this world. And yet, those first human beings, Adam and Eve, turned away from God and tried to find happiness on their own. And lots of things go wrong then in the Bible until eventually we meet a man called Abraham. And a couple of years ago, we started a series in the life of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And God made Abraham a promise. Let me read to you. It's there on the top of your sheet. So you'll need these inside your sheets. If you don't have one, raise a hand. Look around. I can see loads. That's where they all are. Anna's hiding them. There's a whole stash. I thought there were more. Haley, if you could just make sure everyone's got one. Hannah, would you like one? Okay. So in Genesis chapter 12, it having become clear that there's no way that humanity can earn their way towards God and be good enough for God, God makes a promise to Abraham. And he says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So happiness is promised to Abraham and through Abraham. And it's an unconditional promise. We see later on in the story of the life of Abraham that God stakes his own life on that promise. And he allows Abraham to have that unconditionally. It's almost like he gives Abraham a limitless moral credit card. And so that throughout that life of Abraham, the question is, can you trust God to make you happy? It looked very, very unlikely that Abraham would have one child, let alone a family that would grow to fill the earth. And so the question was, can you trust God to make you happy? And then, indeed, Abraham did have a son, Isaac, a miracle baby. And then in the life of Isaac and Jacob, we asked the question, do you want God to make you happy? Or rather, do you want God to make you happy rather than to try and do it yourself? And so we saw the family line of Isaac turn into the line of Jacob, and the family grew. And now we enter the life of Jacob. And we were told in the previous chapter, this is the family line of Jacob, but it starts to zoom in on the man Joseph. And the question here, as we look at this very dysfunctional family that we were looking at last week, is the question, can you see how God could make you happy? I mean, how could God bless or make a family like this happy? And we started to see what a dysfunctional family it was, as we saw how Joseph was given wonderful dreams of how he would rule, but then all those dreams are smashed to pieces as his brothers sell him into slavery. And so this dysfunctional family, it looks like it's going to be impossible for God to make them happy, and certainly they don't deserve it. And just in case you're any doubt that they might deserve it, we get to Genesis chapter 38. And so you'll need to turn in your Bibles to page 43. So there should be a Bible in front of you. Please be turning to page 43. The passage doesn't fit on our sheets. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it and kind of explain some of the things that we might not see in it as we go along, and then come back and reflect on it. And so if you like taking notes, you'll see there's a big gap at the top. And that's for you to write down anything that strikes you as we read it through. Don't feel you have to write anything down. You don't get any brownie points for writing stuff down. It's just if it helps you. Here we come to this story. It feels totally out of place, partly because we ended with Joseph going off to Egypt, and then the rest of the next 12 chapters or so are all about the life of Joseph and how God is going to do something amazing and take him from slavery through to ruling, as his dream suggested. Sorry to spoil the story for you, but many of you will know the story of Joseph. And then suddenly you get this random chapter, and it feels like it shouldn't be here. It feels totally out of place. And it feels particularly out of place because of this, and that's the title for today's talk, A Family Beyond Grace and Hope. Is this a family beyond grace and hope? I met a guy this week. I was just out on the street chatting to another pastor, Phil Tate, some of you will know, and Phil just felt this real sense that he needed to pray for this guy who was walking past. So he interrupted my conversation, how rude of him. And he just went over to this guy, and I assumed Phil knew this man. And he just said, "Can I pray for you?" And the man said, "I am beyond prayer. I am beyond grace and hope." And wonderfully, Phil prayed for him. He let him pray for him. But he had that feeling of I am beyond grace and hope. And maybe you come to church this morning feeling beyond grace and hope for the thoughts, the things you've done that have pushed God away out of the picture. Well, here we meet a family beyond grace and hope, seemingly. Let's read. Genesis 38, page 43. At that time, so at the time that Joseph was being sold into slavery, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hirah. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. Now this is very significant. It may feel just like some random geographical detail, but actually what Judah is doing here is he's walking away from the family of blessing. He's walking away from the family where God has said, I will make this family a blessing to the whole world. And Judah walks away from that. He stops believing the promises of God. He's supposed to be separate and distinct from the Canaanites and marrying within the families that God has set apart. But instead, he becomes just like the people of the land. And they were known as being really, really awful people. There's evidence at the time of them burning children and raping and all kinds of just horrible stuff. And Judah just blends in. He's going to disappear into the mess of Canaan. That's what it looks like here. And it says then, verse 2, he married her and made love to her. That's very nice of the translators to say that, because the Hebrew text is much more matter of fact. It says literally, he took her and went into her. There's nothing about a lovely wedding day. Here we get a man who's motivated by what he sees with his eyes and what he can get with his body. And for him, it's all about the sex. Now, if you think that's bad, it's going to get worse. Okay, this is about the most X-rated chapter of the Bible. It's about as bad as it could get without being deliberately pornography. Verse 3, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named You know that tradition in some communities where, the first word that comes to mind, that's what you call a child. So Judah, what will you call him? Okay, we'll write that down. And there we are. So he gets his name. He's obviously not very good at naming children. So the next child, Shua, his wife or his woman, decides to name herself. Verse 4, she conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. And she gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Now, joking aside, the fact that Judah isn't involved in the naming of Onan and Shelah shows he's given up on any idea that God's promises could count for him. Names meant something very deep, and what you wanted for your child or your longings would be reflected in the name of your child. And Judah is just saying, whatever. Call them whatever. Anyway, verse 6, Judah does his fatherly duty in those days, and he got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn was wicked or evil in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death. Now, that statement, that idea that God would put anyone to death in that way, is a very, very rare statement, even in the Bible. And so, in some ways, he must have been seriously evil, because there was some pretty awful stuff going on in that land. It also shows us that God can take life just like that. But I also think the reason it's mentioned there, because in some ways, God is the one, we're told God is the one who gives and takes away. Whenever God chooses to take life, he takes life, whatever age that might be. And I think the reason this is mentioned, because it sets something up that we're going to see in a moment. Verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. Now, this may seem strange, but this is to do with the customs of the time, not particularly among biblical families or among all families at that time. We can start to understand that in a culture, in an ancient culture, a childless widow was rightly seen as one of the most vulnerable people in society. The idea that you're a woman and women didn't have the same status, wasn't normal for women to work jobs, and so their identity was often found in being a mother. And so if they got married without children, they'd have no one then to raise up who would then provide for them. And it's unlikely that other men would look at them and think, oh, I want to marry her because she's already been married. And so they were seen as the most vulnerable in society. And so it was the duty of a father-in-law to take care of her, and then often to honor her dead husband. The convention was that the next available son would marry her and enable her to have children to continue the older son's, the heir's family line. So that was the convention of the time, and the responsibility was for the father-in-law to take care. Now, Onan didn't have to, so the younger son didn't have to then take on his brother's wife, but Onan accepts this responsibility, and he looks honorable, therefore, on the outside. But we discover it is only on the outside. Do you see verse 9? But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to avoid putting offspring for his brother. So basically, he's taken Tamar, his brother's wife. He quite likes the look of her, and he wants to use her as a sex toy. But the one thing that would give her status and value in society at the time, he denies her because he wants to be the one who gets rich on the inheritance. Isn't that sick? And so no surprise, verse 10, what he did was wicked or evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death also. So here we now have Tamar, who is twice widowed. And then Judah needs to look nice at this point. So verse 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, so initially, this is looking nice. But then he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So he's pretending to offer her his son Shelah. But clearly, he's in denial about the mess of his family, and he's blaming Tamar for the death of his sons. So he sends her back to where she came from, back to her father's house, away from his household. He absolves himself of responsibility, sends her back, says that she'll be able to marry his younger son, but he has no intention because he says, oh, Shelah may die too, just like his brothers. So rather than Judah thinking, I have screwed up this family big time, I have abandoned the promises of God, I have failed to bring up my children, I've had two sons who were so evil that the Lord took their lives. One of them used this young woman as a sex toy. Instead of owning responsibility for himself and his family, he blames Tamar for the death of his sons. He's thinking, well, she must be jinxed. You know, two of them have died under her. There's going to be a third. And he doesn't want to admit what a mess he was. He doesn't want to admit what an awful father he is. Instead, he wants to say, she's bad news. There's something wrong with her. And he sends her away. And we begin to start to see something that, although in not this awful graphic way, goes on in our own hearts. Often when we've done something wrong and that gets pointed out, or there's a situation that comes about that doesn't look good because of the way we are, we immediately find others to blame and we put it on them. Anyway, Tamar went to live in her father's household, so she's away. He's got rid of the problem. Now imagine Tamar heading back to her family and her family saying, oh, how did you get on with Judah's family? That Judah who's famous, for his father Jacob and his grandfather Isaac and his great-grandfather Abraham. Apparently they've got the promises of God. How did you get on in that great family? Oh, Dad, they are horrible. My first husband was so evil that the only good thing was that he died. And then my second husband abused me like a sex toy, and so he died. And now my father-in-law has got rid of me and he's left me with no family, no status, no prospects. She goes back into the world, and God's name is shamed by the total injustice of the family that God has promised to bless. Well, verse 12. After a long time, enough time for Tamar to know that Judah has deceived her and has no intention of giving her his third son, Shelah. Judah's wife, the daughter of Shuah, died. So now technically, Judah is free himself to marry Tamar and give her a family. But clearly he has no intention of doing so. In fact, something far worse. When Judah, we're told, had recovered from his grief, or rather, the period of official mourning was over. Now, do you remember he told Tamar to stay dressed in widow's clothes, so she would have the permanent identity of a widow? But he happily finishes his official period of mourning. He went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah the Adullamite went with him. Now, the first readers of this would have gone, he's gone up to the sheep shearing festival. I know what the sheep shearing festival is like. A bit like if you've ever been to university, you might think, I know what Freshers' Week is like. Or I know what that kind of thing is like. I know what Glastonbury's like. The sheep shearing was a pagan festival when people would get drunk and sleep around. And even more than that, there were cult prostitutes who hung around in kind of makeshift temples to the pagan deities. And in the superstition of the time, they thought, I know what, the best way to remind the gods as to the fact that we want fertility to be happening among our sheep is to remind them how this works. And so men would go and sleep with the prostitutes to remind their gods that this is what they wanted the rams to do with the ewes. And Judah goes up to that kind of festival. Verse 13, when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, well, she gets into action. Verse 14, she took off her widow's clothes, she covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then she sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she'd not been given to him as a wife. She knows what Judah's done. She knows that he's deceived her. Tamar also knows what Judah is like. She knows that he is a total hypocrite with double standards, and that he's off to satisfy his own sexual desires while condemning others who might do the same. And knowing what he's like, she takes a massive risk to get the justice she thinks is hers. Do you see verse 15? When Judah saw her all covered up, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it, she asked. He said, what pledge shall I give you? Well, how about your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. Now, those things would have been the equivalent of his passport and his credit card of the day, his identity documents and the way he would pay for things if he didn't have cash or a goat on him. The seal would be there, putting his insignia. It would also be the seal that defined his family line as well. So he was putting his name to it, also his family name to it. She is getting the things he wants most. But what does he want even more than that? He wants to have sex with this prostitute. And so he gave them to her and he slept with her and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put back on her widow's clothes. And meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah, you can imagine him starting to get scared at this point. Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. No, I've done my part of the bargain. I'm going to have to let those identity documents go and just hope that she's thrown them in a bin somewhere." He doesn't want to make a big deal of this because he knows just how humiliating it'll be for him. So he's left his seal, his mark of the family line, and that mark of the family line would also be the mark of his God. And so he's given his status for himself and his whole family in their relationship with God to a prostitute. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned to death." Wow. It's been pretty bad so far, but this is the lowest point, isn't it? I mean, this is enormously hateful. The first readers would have been shocked. We might think, oh, well, that must have been normal at the time. No, the idea of burning anyone for anything was seen as just vindictively torturous. She has been used and abused, and now her worst abuser wants to burn her, claiming that he's righteous. This stinks of hypocrisy. And what's he doing? Well, he's playing God, isn't he? Let her be put to death, burned to death. We heard earlier on, the Lord put them to death. He's playing God. He's being the judge. He's taking control. And yet he's a horrific hypocrite. And so, verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." I mean, you can imagine this, can't you? I don't know if this has ever been filmed, this scene, but her being dragged out to be put on a massive burning pyre, to be burned to death, screaming. And as she does, she just gets this stuff out of her clothes and she says, "Whose are these?" The tension, the drama. Verse 26, Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I." The word righteous, also just. She has more justice than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. And we're going to come back and think about that, but let's just finish the story. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "This is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez, which means broken out or breakthrough. And then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. So somehow these two little babies are coming out of the birth canal together. One's arm is ahead of the other, but actually the body of the first is out. And so the one who looks like they're coming out first actually comes out second. And this is a little throwback, a little reminder of Esau and Jacob who wrestled in the womb. And the second actually ended up being first. Anyway, I just want us to pause there. And I want you just to think to yourself or chat to your neighbour about how does this chapter make you feel? How does this chapter make you feel? Have a minute. I'm just looking at the time and realise we don't have much. So, anyone who feels free wants to shout out. How does it make you feel? You can. Confused. Okay. Yeah, I think that is a predominant feeling. When I first came to this, I was like, oh man, I've got to preach on this. Sad. Yeah. Yeah, it is a really, really sad, horrible story, isn't it?
Sick and shocked.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shows God's justice, but why going through all that?
Yeah.
Could have been justice before.
Yeah, it sort of shows God's justice, but even the bit I found most difficult was the Lord put them to death. Let me just flick up this slide. This is some questions we found helpful recently to sort of set the agenda for Bible passages that we've been looking at. And these questions seem not to work with passages like the one we were looking at last week and this week. What does this passage teach us about God? That he puts some evil people to death and not others? I mean, wouldn't it be great to read in your history books? In 1939, there was a really, really evil man called Hitler who wanted to exterminate 6 million Jews, but the Lord put him to death. But he didn't. So you've got this, okay, God's doing some justice, but it doesn't feel very just. Then what about the next question? What does this passage teach us about people? That they're pretty horrible, especially the ones God has chosen? The chosen family of God? This is weird. In what ways does it prompt us to praise? I don't know. Examples to follow? Which one are you going to pick? Go out and sleep with your father-in-law if you're really desperate? Commands to obey? If this passage is true, what will you commit to this week? Just to read on and hope there's something better? Just have a look at your sheets. On the left, Matthew chapter 1. We get to see a little glimpse of why this is in the Bible. Because Judah would end up in the family line of Jesus. So Matthew chapter 1, the beginning of the gospel, the first page of the New Testament, when good news breaks through. This is the family line of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of, and then lots of names, including the great King David. And then we end up with the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So Judah, even though Joseph is kind of the main character in the story, and he ends up being the main character on the main stage in the West End, actually Judah is the one who's going to rise to prominence. But Matthew chapter 1 should make us feel more uncomfortable. Like, why didn't the Bible writers leave this bit out? This is the kind of stuff you'd want to whitewash out. If you're writing the history of Great Britain, that you want to make great again, you're not going to highlight this kind of stuff, are you? No nation does that. Which kind of means it must be true. It must have happened. But still, that doesn't comfort us. It's still deeply uncomfortable. On your sheets, just the verse below that is a famous verse from Romans 3, which we'll come back to, but it says this: all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace. Now, if you go up to someone on the street, or if I started the sermon and just read that, you'd think, oh yeah, that's nice, okay? So all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Yeah, I recognize that. I get it. Yeah, we're all sinners. We all mess up. And so we need God to be kind to us and gracious to us and merciful to us. You read a story like this, and suddenly that sort of hits you in the stomach. And you're like, really? Could God justify people like that? And so we get to the first point on your sheets as we kind of sum up and bring all the pieces together. First we get the point, no one is beyond the gracious promises of God. That's what this chapter is there to show us. No one is beyond the gracious promises of God. I mean, if God gave to Abraham a moral credit card that he could use and God would pay the debt, Judah is filling it up big time, isn't he? And so if you're coming here thinking there's no hope for me, then Judah is an encouragement. If you're coming here thinking, I'm all right, I'm kind of a nice person and God should accept me, then this passage will really offend you. Because why should this evil, evil man be allowed in there? This abuser of an innocent young woman. You see, out of this one man, Judah, is going to come the family that God is going to save. And depending on how good or bad we feel, we may struggle to trust the promises of God. There's a story told of a guy who was in America before most of the bridges across the Mississippi were built. And he ended up crossing the Mississippi in the winter, mid of winter, and by bridge, and then going much further down, and then trying to get back home, and he could see the light of his home across the river. But there was no way in time before nightfall he was going to get back over the bridge. But he saw that the Mississippi River was completely frozen over. And he thought, you know what, either I'm going to die here in the cold, or I'm going to end up back safe at home, and so I'm going to try and walk across the ice. And he gets down onto his hands and knees, and just very, very slowly, he's testing the ice to see if it can hold his weight. And he pushes out, just really, he's crawling along, desperately worried there's going to be a crack and he's going to fall to his doom. And then he hears this noise behind him of galloping hooves and rolling cartwheels. And this massive team of horses and a huge cart full of coal comes charging past him across the ice. And he sees it get past and cross the other side totally fine. And so he stands up and he walks home. And I think sometimes we're a bit like that. We feel the weight of our sin and we think, can the promises of God hold me? Can I get safely home based on the fact that God has promised that if I trust in him and his promises, I will be taken to the new creation. I'll be safe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we crawl along thinking, no, God can't accept me. I'm going to fall through. Oh no, I better not do anything worse. And then we read about Judah. And the massive coach and horses trundles over the promises of God. And they hold. And they hold. No one is beyond the gracious promises of God. Now that's a huge encouragement. The next point is a big challenge. Because this is your founding father. This Judah is one of the founding fathers of Israel, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. He's the line from which the king comes who becomes the Lord Jesus Christ. This is the Messiah's line. This is what you depend on. And the family that Jesus comes from is the family that he comes for. And if you identify with Jesus, you're saying, actually, my CV is like his. And the question is, will you own that CV? You see, the most encouraging point of this passage is when Judah changes his mind, when he repents, when he recognizes what he's done. You see, Judah is about to burn her because he thinks she's the reason that there's all these problems in my family. And I knew it. I knew she was super evil. And they've just told me she's a prostitute. And so she deserves to be burned to death. She deserves the worst death that anyone could get because she's brought all this on my family. None of it's my fault. I'm fine. I'm better. Look at all those people out there. I'm better than them. Look at this evil woman. If we just burn her, then it'll be fine. And he justifies himself and he puts it on her. She made me do it. And then verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Literally, recognize these. It's the same word that Judah had used to his father the week before. Sorry, in last week's passage, decades before, when Joseph's robe was torn and bloodied and they faked his death. He said, see, recognize. And his father broke down in tears at the loss of his son. And those words are used back at him. And then Judah recognizes not only his identity documents, but he says, this Canaanite whore, is more righteous, more just than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Suddenly his sin is exposed. And rather than trying to cover it up, I mean, he could. He was a powerful man. She was just some random woman who admitted to prostitution. He could have said, oh, no, those aren't mine. She's faked them. She's nicked them. Look, she just went round the back. She nicked. But he's convicted. He realizes she's caught him red-handed. And he sees in a woman he thought was the problem, actually, I'm worse than her. He's not saying she's righteous. She's not. Her life is pretty messed up too. But he can't look down on her anymore. And this changes his mindset. One of the most successful scams of the last couple of years, I don't know if you've personally received it, I actually got it in my inbox. It's called the webcam blackmail. I don't know if you've heard of this, or the sextortion scam, where someone's sent emails to all the emails they can get hold of, and they've said, we've been watching your webcam, and we've seen all the things that you've done on that webcam. And unless you pay us this amount of money, then we're going to send to all your contacts, because we've hacked your computer and we've got all your contacts, we're going to send the video images of all that you've been doing in front of your webcam. And it's one of the most successful scams. I mean, lots of people knew, even though they were frightened. But that kind of feeling of, oh my word, what have they seen? Imagine someone had hidden cameras across your house. We've seen everything you've done, everything you've said, and we've picked the most juiciest bits from the last couple of years. And unless you pay up, we're going to reveal it to all your friends and family. What about worse? Kind of like some of those sci-fi films. We've got hidden cameras in your mind, and we've spotted the thoughts that you've had. Do you recognize these? Do you recognize these? And suddenly, if that was us, and the idea that they could be projected on the screen here for all of us to see, think of the horror and the sickness you would feel at the pit of your stomach. And Judah gets that. Tamar's able to do that for Judah. But you know what? You don't need a hidden camera to know what's going on in my mind. I don't need a hidden camera to know what's going on in yours. It's there in the next verses on your sheets. Romans 3. Paul has just been showing that in his letter to the Romans that the Gentiles, the nations have behaved very badly, and all the Jews are going, tut, 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 yeah, they're awful. And then he's shown that the Jews are actually just as bad in their sort of self-righteousness and their religiosity, and they're looking down on others. And so he goes, verse 9 of Romans chapter 3 on the sheets. What should we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. For we've already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are under the power of sin, as is written. And then he writes down your CV and my CV. This is your righteousness CV. This is what you can plead before God in terms of what should let you into heaven. He says, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And if we read that and we think, no, I'm better than that, then we've missed the whole point. You see, that is what we're like in and of ourselves when our sinful independence is let loose. And if we understand that is the potential, and we know in our deepest, darkest thoughts and the most horrible things we've ever thought, we know that we have the potential for all those things, and we can praise God that we don't have the opportunity to carry them out. But if that is our righteousness CV, You know, actually, if we can confess that, if we can say, yes, that's what I'm like, it can begin to transform us. Because then we can look at others who we think are the problems in our lives, who are messing everything up for us, and we can say, no, they're more righteous than me. No, they have justice on their side. That person who I thought was falsely accusing me of that and said and told me off for that, well, actually, they may have got the details wrong, but it doesn't matter that they misrepresented me in that area because I'm so much worse in this. And actually, we have a freedom to be misrepresented, to be criticized. And we don't need to be worried or anxious because actually there are the details of our lives, of our thought patterns, of the deepest, darkest versions of us available for all to see. And so instead of trying to persuade God that we're good enough to get into his heaven, we can go to God and we can plead for mercy. And so as we close, the question is, will you receive the grace of God? Will you receive the grace of God? I don't think we're going to have time, and I think it would feel like sort of squeezing it in to take the Lord's Supper as I'd planned, because I'd like us to reflect on it, and maybe we'll have time next week. But when we do take the Lord's Supper, what we have is we have a little piece of bread that is a token of the broken body of the Lord Jesus Christ, who was the one person whose CV was perfect and clean and pure, who never did anything wrong. And whereas we deserve to be put to death, cut off from God for all eternity, he did not. And yet he willingly went to the cross and his body was broken for us. And he cried out on that cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you rejected me? Why have you cut me off? So that as we trust in him, all of our CV can be placed on him, and he pays for it all in full. And the more we get to know how amazing he is, the more we see the wonder of the depth of that thick ice, as it were, that is so secure that we can travel straight across it. We can trust in Jesus. We can give him everything and know that he has saved us. And as we take that sip of the wine that represents his blood shed for us, we can know the perfect lifeblood that was flowing through his veins that should never die. He never deserved to die. He was the one human being who ever lived who never deserved to die. That lifeblood can be given to us, so that as we swap places with him, his death gives us life. Do you see how the passage in Romans continues there on your sheets? There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. There's actually no difference between Tamar and Judah, although actually Judah was much worse than Tamar. But all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No one deserves to get into God's presence, but verse 24, all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his justice because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, or his justice, it's the same word, at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. You see, Judah was trying to justify himself by burning Tamar. Then he sees that Tamar's better than him. He thinks, I've got no hope, and all he can rely on are the promises of God. And he was hoping that God would send a Savior who was great enough to rescue even him. But we don't need to look forward and just hold on to the promises of God, wondering how God is going to do it. We can look back and see that he has done it. He has demonstrated his justice so that he can be patient with us. And you see, if you recognize that you're just as bad or worse than anyone else, and you need to depend on the mercy and grace of God, it will change how you live. If you know God loves you simply because of his grace and mercy and his goodness, not because of anything you've done, not because you're good enough, you're not. If you know that, it will transform your life And this is the turning point for Judah. Judah, after this point, goes back to his father's family. And then when there's a famine, we discover later on that his youngest brother, sort of Joseph's replacement, as it were, Benjamin, ends up in deadly danger. And Judah offers his own life instead of Benjamin's. You see, recognizing that he's as bad as he could possibly be means he can accept the grace of God. And then rather than trying to prove himself or get stuff for himself, he can give himself for others. You see, if you get this message, it will transform you. So Ed, why don't you come up and lead us in our last couple of songs. We're going to sing the song that we planned for the Lord's Supper, but for the sake of the kids' workers, we're not going to share the Lord's Supper, but we're going to reflect. And maybe as we sing this first song, I will kneel in the dust at the foot of the cross. Maybe if we're not quite there yet, I can't pressurize you to feel the weight of your sin. But if we really get just how much we deserve God to reject us, then we will feel like we're down in the dust, that we deserve nothing. But to recognize that we deserve nothing is such a great place to be, because that's where you can, as it were, in your mind's eye, come to the foot of the cross and see that God wasn't there with a checkboard saying, are you one of the good ones? Yep, I'll let you in. No, he was there hanging with his arms stretched out wide, saying, I'm doing this for you. I'm having mercy on you. The wrath, the anger that you deserve, you do deserve it, has gone because it's been laid on Jesus. And you know, the last thing he said as he died on that cross was, it is finished. It is paid in full so that you can be free. Well, as Ed and Sarah begin to sing, feel free to sit or stand as you feel led. And then we'll go into our last song, The Lion of Judah. You see, as Ed said at the beginning, that the great tribe of Judah becomes the name of great power and kingship. And Jesus was that ultimate Lion of Judah that was prophesied into Judah's life. And he was the great king, the great and powerful king, but he was also the lamb who was slain, the sacrificial lamb who paid the penalty for us. So that you can be, as it were, proud to be in Judah's family, because you're just like him in your sin, but just like him by being saved.